development of countries depend on oil. States will go to great lengths to acquire an oil production method or to access any amounts of oil supply. We use petroleum products to fuel our airplanes, cars, and trucks, to heat our homes, and to make products like medicines and plastics. Even though petroleum products are vital in our everyday life, it does not mean it is the best resource. The production, moving, and use of fossil fuels can harm the environment through air and water pollution. The oil industry business comes with grave environmental costs, including toxic pollution and global warming.
Regardless of the known effects to our environment, the industry for oil is huge in the United States. We claim 5% of the world population, but are responsible for 1/4 of the world's oil consumption. The search for oil is the leading cause of war. Between 1/4 and 1/2 of interstate wars since 1973 have been linked to oil. This causes irreparable damage to the environment through shelling, infrastructure destruction, and in this instant, contamination of local streams, rivers, and therefore larger bodies of water. The building of an oil pipeline increases maximum profit for investors. Transportation of oil truck by truck just doesn't work as efficiently. Building this extensive pipeline in the Middle East will increase profits to investors. The underlying problem in the Middle East is that there is no stable government in place, so who is to negotiate their trade deals for oil? It has become a power struggle for the oil regions and rights to its profits. This is another example where man shows greediness rules over a healthy environment.
Our war against Bashar Assad began in 2000 when Qatar proposed to construct a $10 billion, 1,500-kilometer pipeline through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Turkey. This pipeline would increase their profits by more than 500%. Major oil companies and investors are out to divide the cost and sulk in the profit. Since then, it has been a tension-filled, non-stop fight for the right to negotiate these lands' oil supply. The devastation to the environment comes from the constant shelling and airstrikes to ISIS oil fields and refineries. Since ISIS makes money through oil smuggling to outer countries, a scorched earth policy has been adopted by the U.S. to cut ISIS funding. The big question about Syria is whether or not targeting oil infrastructure is a sound, long-term strategy. We could prevent long-term damage to the environment, socioeconomic development, and public health with an alternative solution.
The problem we have as a society now is that large investors only see the money in oil. Their greed for money is much greater than their care for the earth. They do not see the destruction caused to the environment by fueling these wars. The environmental footprint of the conflict, now in its 5th year, keeps growing. The impacts of these strikes vary, but civilians in these oil-filled regions are the most affected. The effects of this oil pollution are devastating and may be irreparable in the long term. Lands and waterways are being poisoned by the oil. Mass destruction of the environments are consequences for humans' carefree use of fuel. For wildlife, oil spills are detrimental to their survival. Being exposed to toxic petroleum products results in lower reproductive rates, organ damage, and even death. Local communities impacted by the pollutants must frequently request federal assistance with cleanup efforts. Even then, oil residues can linger for years to come after a cleanup is complete.
Time and time again in history, we have seen disasters caused in the drilling for oil that have lasting effects. More recently, the explosion of an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico released a total of 4.9 million barrels of crude oil released before the leak was capped. This makes the Deepwater Horizon the biggest oil spill to have occurred in U.S.-controlled waters, exceeding the Exxon spill of 1989, which released 7,500,000 barrels. 3% of oil was recovered and about 50 to 60% remained in water. 8,332 plus species lived within the vicinity of the oil spill. This is just one example of devastating consequences to our wildlife and environment that came from this industry.
We can see the underlying issue is an obvious problem of greediness in an industry that has little care for the environment and a lot of interest in their money. We as people need a massive change in our treatment of the world. Becoming more aware of the environmental consequences is the first step. We must realize that we as people have allowed this sort of behavior through lifestyles that are dependent on oil products. An unwillingness to make sacrifice for a cleaner, healthier future is affecting us. Ultimately, a transition to renewable resources is the answer, but that's a slow process. For now, raising awareness of these issues through well-known public figures that can reach a broader audience is a good start. Early in the year 2016, Leonardo DiCaprio became the UN Messenger of Peace. Since then, he has publicly denounced large oil corporations, stating that we simply cannot afford to allow them to determine the future of humanity.
Last week, President Obama told those who continue to deny the irrefutable science behind climate change that they will find themselves increasingly lonely in a swell of voices calling for action. But studies also show us that those who deny the reality of climate change will also find themselves less economically successful. We simply cannot afford to allow the corporate greed of the coal, oil, and gas industries to determine the future of humanity. Our planet cannot be saved unless we leave fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. 20 years ago, we described this problem as an addiction. Today, we possess the means to end this reliance. Over the last several years, organizations and individuals worth $3.8 trillion have already committed to divest their fossil fuel holdings and replace them with new investments in clean, renewable energy projects. And leaders like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos have already pledged to help build a zero-emissions future. I ask you to join them, because if we all do our part and act with bold leadership, we can achieve major, meaningful progress. It is not only an inevitable transition, it is also imperative for the future of our planet. Which brings me to the other side of this very important issue, and the flip side to the environmental crisis. And that is the protection of our planet's last remaining natural ecosystems. Ecosystems that provide us with breathable air, drinkable water, fertile soil, and bountiful seas. These complex ecosystems can never be replaced, and they are the foundation of our global economy, and more importantly, our interconnected climate. Life without them, as we know it, would simply collapse. Imagine what we can all do with more partnerships. With the alliance of many of you in this room, so much can be done if we all work together. With your help, we can quickly identify and fund the most innovative and effective projects that have the greatest potential to avert the crisis we face.
And here we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil, which is often imported from unstable parts of the world. The best way to break this addiction is through technology. Since 2001, we have spent nearly $10 billion to develop cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable alternative energy sources.
Already, this oil spill is the worst environmental disaster America has ever faced. And unlike an earthquake or a hurricane, it's not a single event that does its damage in a matter of minutes or days. The millions of gallons of oil that have spilled into the Gulf of Mexico are more like an epidemic, one that we will be fighting for months and even years.